morning. Glad you're here today. My name is Lance. I'm excited to be with you. We are in week 2 of a new series we're starting called Limitless Grace. We're going to study the books of Jonah and Hosea. And we started with a really important question last week when Jamie taught us, and that question was this: how do I limit God's grace? You know, we all like the idea of grace. It sounds good. We agree with that concept of grace, but sometimes we put limits on it. We look at other people, what they might believe, what they might have done, and we say, surely grace doesn't reach that far. We might look at ourselves and say, if you knew what I've done in my past, the way I can be, the way I think, you would know God's grace doesn't cover all of that. But we're finding in this series as we study these two prophets is that God's grace is limitless. And we started that last week in the book of Jonah. Jamie took us through just the first 3 verses in Jonah chapter 1 last week. But we learned a couple of important things. First, we learned that Jonah was a prophet of God. He was called to speak for God. He was one of those covenant watchdogs, like we learned. We also know that God spoke to Jonah, and he called him to go to this place called Nineveh. Now, that was a problem, right? Because Nineveh was in this brutal, violent empire of Assyria. And Jonah didn't like those people. They weren't God's chosen people. They were bad people. And he didn't want to go there. So he didn't. What he did instead was he did the opposite. You can see on a map we're going to put up here that Jonah, instead of going to Nineveh, like God had called him to, he went the opposite direction. He went down to the port city of Joppa, and then he boarded a ship to try to go to Tarshish. Now, Tarshish, as you can tell, it's the opposite direction of where God told him to go. And not only that, in Jonah's mind, that was probably the farthest place he could think of to get away from God. That's what it says in verse 3, that he did all of this to get away from the presence of the Lord. He didn't like what God was doing. He couldn't understand what God was doing, so he ran from it. Jonah couldn't see that God might have a plan. He couldn't see that God might be doing something bigger than what he could understand. Sometimes that happens. We can't see what God's doing. Several years ago, when I was a senior in college, I was hitting that point in your senior year where it was time to kind of start figuring out what I was going to do when I got out. And I really only had one serious job offer, no real opportunity other than this one. And it was a good job. It was a job I wanted to do. It was in the field I wanted to go into. But there was one big problem. It was in Houston, Texas. So I didn't grow up in Houston. I didn't grow up in the Woodlands. I grew up in Texas, but the part of Texas I grew up in, there's no trees, there's no traffic, there's no humidity, and most importantly, there's no hurricanes. And I was scared of all those things, even the trees. So I didn't want to come down here. But like I said, it was sort of that one job opportunity that I just couldn't say no to. So 2005, packed up my truck, everything I owned, and my parents helped me move into a 1-bedroom apartment right in the middle of Houston. And I can tell you, those first 2 years were every bit as bad as I thought they would be. I was this small town kid, and I wasn't ready for the big city. It was overwhelming to me. There was just so much going on. Not only that, I had a hard time making good friends, hard time finding community. I was also single when I moved down here, and kind of naively, I thought I would meet someone like right away when I got down here, and that didn't happen either. On top of all of that, now I just got out of college, this fun place where I just got to hang out with my friends, and now somebody's telling me I got to work 40 hours a week. I didn't like that at all. I was unhappy, and so I made a decision. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to move back home. But there was a problem. I just couldn't seem to make it happen. I talked to some people I trusted for wisdom and guidance, and they all kind of said the same thing. I don't think you should leave that job. I don't think you should go anywhere. I was kind of scrolling through other opportunities. What else could I do? Where else could I go? And nothing felt quite right. So then I got this idea. I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to get that 2nd degree. And so I told my boss that at the time, and he said, you know what? You can actually do that here, and we'd actually love to help you pay for that. And I was like, no, that was my way out. I kept trying and trying and trying to get out of here, but nothing was working out. I was even praying over and over, God, show me a path. Help me to feel confident. Help me, give me some kind of sign that it's okay to leave. Nothing. It was like every time I prayed, God was just telling me, you got to stay here. You can't go anywhere. But I felt stuck. I felt like he wasn't letting me do what I needed to do. And so I kept asking him a simple question. Why am I stuck? Why won't you let me go? What purpose is there in this kind of struggle? You know, we have those seasons in life, those times where we're struggling and we can't tell what the plan is. We just keep wondering, why am I where I'm at right now? Your job or your family life, or your relationships, they're not what you thought they'd be, and you don't see an end in sight. Worry, fear, frustration, stress, that kind of has become the norm, and you don't see a way out of those feelings. And all the while, we might look to God and we say, why do you have me living in this place or dealing with this person? Why are you letting me hurt and struggle like this? And in those seasons, you feel like you're in a storm. And when we get stuck in a storm, we kind of just focus on one thing, either getting through the storm to the other side or finding shelter, hiding out, and just waiting on it to be over. We don't look for any purpose in the storms. We just want it to end. And that's how we feel in those seasons of life that are hard. We don't see a purpose in it, so we just kind of want to hide out, wait for it to be over. But could we be missing something in those seasons of life that might be helpful? Are we limiting what God can do or show us because we just don't want to be where he has us in the moment? If God's grace is limitless, how do I feel it when I feel stuck? That's the question I want to answer today as we dive into the rest of chapter 1 of Jonah. We left Jonah last week in verse 3, having boarded a ship, like we said, that was on its way to Tarshish. And he did that to get away from God. He didn't like God's plan. He didn't want to see God show mercy to these people of Nineveh, so he went the other way. And today we see what happened next when Jonah decided to run. Look at chapter 1 of verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. So God responds immediately, and it's not really subtle. It's pretty violent. As soon as Jonah is disobedient, God throws this storm at him. The language in Jonah is sensational. It's meant to grab your attention, put you in the moment. So God hurls a wind at the sea. It starts a mighty storm, a storm so strong that the ship itself is threatening to break apart. Now, it's interesting in light of our overall message in this series because we're talking about God's grace. And the first thing God does in response to disobedience is throw this huge storm at Jonah, a storm that is threatening Jonah's life, but not just Jonah's life, all these sailors who are on this ship with him. Guys who had really nothing to do with Jonah's decision. It's bad enough that these sailors who've made a career of sailing are doing a couple things that really show you how afraid they are. It shows you how bad the situation is. You see that they're praying, and we'll come back to that in a bit, but you also see that they're just throwing cargo overboard. That cargo was their livelihood. It's probably what made the trip profitable. So you can see how desperate they are in their willingness to just throw it overboard. But that's not all they did to save themselves. It says they each cried out to his God. They probably recognized this wasn't just any normal storm. There's got to be something supernatural at play here. It hit them so hard and so fast that they're all looking up, asking some higher power, really any higher power, to take this away, to show them why this is happening, to get them out of it. So the situation on deck is crazy. Men are praying to all their different gods. They're throwing their cargo overboard. They're stuck in a storm. They're doing everything they can to get unstuck. So what's Jonah doing during all of this? Is he as worried as they are? Look at verse 5. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." So you read that right. In the middle of this crisis, Jonah was down inside the ship, fast asleep. Now, how could this be? With everything he's done, with everything that you read that's going on in this moment, how is it possible to be asleep during all of that? Well, imagine Jonah's state of mind at this point. He's just given up his career as a prophet of God. He's told God he's rejected what he asked him to do and gone the other way. He probably knows how wrong he is. He knows he's headed the wrong direction. And so as a result, he's sitting in some state of apathy and depression. It's not uncommon when you're in that state to seek a way to sort of check out of the situation, to avoid the implications of what he's done. He's checked out. He clearly doesn't care enough about what's going on to get up. And the language used here in chapter 1 of Jonah, it actually paints a really good picture of what he's doing in this moment. Notice how many times, if you look at chapter 1, how many times the word down is used. You know, God told Jonah in verse 2, arise, call out against the Ninevites. The captain in verse 6 tells him the same thing, arise, call out to your God. But what is Jonah doing? In verse 3, he went down to Joppa. He went down into the ship. Again, in verse 6, he had gone down into the inner part of the ship and laid down. Everyone is telling him to get up and speak up, but the narrator makes it clear that Jonah's doing the opposite. He's checking himself out of the situation. And we all do that sometimes in different ways. We check out. There's a thing I've noticed, and honestly, I'm as guilty of it as anyone. Ever since we've had smartphones, we have this thing in our pocket that can sort of take us out of reality. We can be entertained, we can find information, we can play games, we can observe other people's lives through social media. And what I've noticed happens sometimes is when things get hard in the real world, we see some difficulty, we find ourselves in conflict, in stress. Sometimes some of us grab our phones and we just start looking down and scrolling. When reality gets too hard, sometimes we try to remove ourselves from it. We look down, away from it. And I think that's what Jonah was doing. Things got difficult. He didn't want to do what God told him to do. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to be in that reality, so he removed himself from it. He went down instead of up. And in verse 6, the captain wakes him up and he's incredulous. He says, how are you sleeping right now? Call out to whoever your God is, because that might be the one that's mad at us. See, most of the people in this region at that time, they had sort of multiple gods that they worshiped and prayed to. They might have had their own individual gods for individual concerns. Their family might have had a god that represented their clan or their family that they prayed to. Then they probably had national gods, gods that were in charge of protecting their nation or their larger people group. And in that system, these sailors are calling out to several gods all at once, hoping to appease the one that's mad. So the captain, when he sees Jonah sleeping, he says, hey, you've got to pray to whoever your God is because that might be the one that could help us right now. And it's actually sad when you think about it. Because here's Jonah, the one person on the ship who knows who the one true God is. He's heard from him. He's spoken to him. He knows he's real. And he's on this ship with a bunch of sailors who are crying out to gods they've never heard from. And they're not going to hear from them. There's one person on the ship who knows what's going on. There's one person on the ship capable of showing them the truth, and he's hiding out, sleeping. They're stuck in a storm, they don't know why, and the prophet of God doesn't care enough to tell them. He still hasn't said anything. He still doesn't have anything to say. So we go back to the sailors. In verse 7, they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, so that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country? Of what people are you? So to their credit, the sailors are still working to figure out, why is this happening? So they do something that was pretty common in their day, that sounds a little strange to us, but they cast lots. This was a way, you see it throughout the scriptures. This was sort of a way that people of that time sort of determined God's will, sought out his direction. And at times it actually showed them God's will and God's direction. So we're not sure exactly what it looked like, but they probably had something similar to dice with a light side and a dark side. 2 light sides meant yes, 2 dark sides might have meant no, one of each just meant roll again. And so they just go around the circle trying to determine who's causing this. And in that system, they finally identify Jonah as the culprit. And when it falls on Jonah, you can tell they immediately want to know a lot more about him. They want to know where he's from, who his people are, why this might be happening. They know wherever he's from, it's probably tied to whatever God he worships. And so they probably think if we can find that out, we might be able to find out why this is happening. So he finally speaks in verse 9. And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. So Jonah's response blows them away. Why is that? Well, he tells them where he's from and saying he's a Hebrew, but then he tells them about his God. These guys were all calling out to their other gods, but Jonah's God is different. He identifies his God as the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. God of heaven on its own would have immediately told these sailors there's something different about this God, that it sat above their other gods. It signified something higher than what they were praying to, but then Jonah adds that this God made the sea and the dry land. And there's actually some humor here if you're paying attention, because here they are on the sea being punished by it, and then Jonah tells them he worships the God who made the sea. In verse 10, this is why they go from kind of afraid to exceedingly afraid. They now know Jonah's God is the one who made the sea, so he must be causing this storm. They also had learned from Jonah that even though he claims to fear this God, he's actually running from him. That's what it says in verse 10, that he had already sort of filled them in on what he was doing. Now, I just imagine how that conversation went for the sailors. Jonah wants to board their ship. He's ready to pay the fare, and they just want to know, where are you going? Where are you headed? He says, I'd like to go to Tarshish. Why do you want to go there? That's a long ways away. That's going to be a long trip. No reason, really. The God I worship, he wants me to do something. I don't really want to do that. I don't like how he's going to handle that. So I think if I go to Tarshish, I'll get away from him. And the sailors probably at that point thought, okay, no big deal. You paid your fare. Let's go. But then things start to escalate, right? The storm gets worse. And then Jonah tells them, well, the God I worship, the one I'm running from, he's actually the one who made the sea, which they're stuck on. And he made the dry land, which they would love to get back to. So now they're really afraid. And ironically, it's Jonah who claims to be the one who fears God, even though his actions are kind of at odds with what God has called him to do. While the sailors, who don't really know God yet, immediately recognize how serious this is. So now they know why they're in the storm, but they're not really sure what to do with it yet. So look at verse 11. They said to him, what shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. So they look to Jonah for direction. The sea's getting worse. You worship the God who made it, so what do we do? They had been hurling their cargo into the sea. And Jonah, using that same word, says you actually need to hurl me into the sea. Jonah's words are revealing. He at least recognizes he's at fault. He recognizes that this is a result of his actions. But it's a sad response because you have to think this isn't the only way they could have gotten out of this storm. See, Jonah was called to go to a people who didn't know the Lord and call out against them for their evil ways, to call on them to repent. And God's purpose in this was to reach a people, to reach the nations, to reach a people who didn't know him. So Jonah ran from that, but then he still finds himself with an opportunity to do that thing God wanted him to do. He finds himself with a people who need God and are just ready to believe. You know, a couple weeks ago, I turned on the TV on a Monday night, planning to kind of relax and watch Monday Night Football. And as soon as I turned it on, I knew something was wrong because the game should have already started. And I turned on the TV and the field's empty, no players on the field. And the first thing I hear is an ESPN anchor of all people saying that we needed to pray for a guy named Damar Hamlin. Now, you probably know the story. Damar Hamlin made a tackle early in that game. Something about that hit put him into cardiac arrest. And in the moment, that night, no one really knew if he was going to survive. And so in this environment where it's usually not okay to talk about God or prayer, suddenly everybody was ready and willing to look up and ask for help. And in moments like those, even people who might not believe are turning to God. So as Christians, as Jesus followers, what are we doing with those opportunities? Are we asleep, checked out, missing the opportunity like Jonah was? Or are we leading the charge to show them God's grace? This is my own opinion based on just reading the story, but I really believe Jonah had an opportunity to share more with these sailors. He could have told them not just that he worshiped Yahweh and that the storm was his fault, but he also could have told them that their false gods were nothing more than that. They're not real. And that he knew the one true God and that they could worship him. Maybe if he'd done that, he could have stayed with them on the ship, but I don't think Jonah thought God's grace should reach that far. So his solution was just recognition of guilt and acceptance that he needed to die. The sailors, however, don't accept this immediately. He's put it on them to throw him overboard, but they don't want to quite yet. In spite of Jonah's weak efforts, these sailors, they're actually starting to believe in this God that Jonah worships. So look at what they did next. Verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So these sailors recognize that it's no small thing to just throw a man overboard, especially a man who serves this God that could throw this kind of storm at them. So they keep trying to push through it. They row as hard as they can to get back to land, but they just keep getting pushed out. So they call out to God, and this is where you see a really important shift in how these sailors view God. See, they were all calling out to their own gods when the storm began. Back in verse 6, the captain told Jonah to pray to his God. He said, "Perhaps the God will save us." Perhaps the God, as in little g, just one of the many gods that might be out there. Now notice in verse 14 who the sailors call out to. They call out to the Lord. He starts using the word Yahweh there. No longer are they taking shots in the dark at their various gods. Now their God has a name, and they recognize that he alone has the authority here. He's the one who put them in this storm, and he's the one who can deliver them from it. So they look to him for answers. And in faith, more faith than the prophet of God who's with them, they do what Jonah is telling them to do. They throw him overboard. Verse 15, so they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea. And the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now, I want you to do the impossible here and pretend this is the first time you've heard this story. Think about it only from the sailors' perspective. From their perspective, they didn't really know quite what to believe. And Jonah's telling them to do this crazy thing, throw me overboard. And then they do it, and suddenly the sea grows calm. Now, as far as they're concerned, Jonah is dead. To them, it's been confirmed that what he said was true. He was guilty of disobedience to God, and his punishment was being thrown into the sea, never to be seen again. And if they wondered this whole time why they were in this storm, they now know who brought it on and who delivered them from that. And look at what they do with that information in verse 16. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. That word for fear, it's used often in this passage. In verse 5, these men were afraid of the storm. And in verse 10, like we said, they were then exceedingly afraid of what might happen to them. And here we see the same word, but it's a different kind of fear. Now, instead of fearing for their own lives or fearing a storm, they fear the Lord exceedingly. You see this kind of fear throughout the Old Testament in relation to God. The fear of the Lord was closely tied to keeping God's decrees and his laws. People who feared the Lord were considered faithful, trustworthy, because it helped them to believe and act morally. Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. God's people, the nation of Israel, whom Jonah was a part of, they were supposed to be distinct in their fear of the Lord. It was a marker for them. Jonah claimed to have this fear, but his actions weren't really consistent with it. He says, I'm a Hebrew, but the thing that should mark him, the way of living that should identify that, it's not there. But there's more irony here in the story that these pagan, polytheistic sailors, they're the ones who seem to actually get it. They now fear the Lord, and as a result, probably when they're back on land, they go make sacrifices and they make vows to the Lord. Those vows are really important because it shows it wasn't just a one-time thing, thanking God for their survival. Vows were a promise to return and make more sacrifices in the future. When vows are mentioned in the Old Testament, it often refers to past promises to come back, to make sacrifices and worship God. So the mention of these sailors making vows confirms that their fear of the Lord was not short-lived. It made a lasting change on them. You know, in the moment, that storm was probably one of the scariest, worst moments of their lives. But because of that storm, they now had a relationship with the one true God. So when they look back at the storm, I imagine they saw it in a new light. It wasn't something where they lost all their cargo. It wasn't something just to be scared of. Now when they look back at it, they saw that it was actually the way God showed them grace. Jonah was supposed to be a messenger of that grace, but he put limits on who deserved it. The beauty of this story is that even the prophet of God couldn't limit God's grace. He couldn't keep God from chasing people down with it. And he chased these sailors down in spite of his messenger botching it. What the sailors learned that Jonah has yet to learn at this point in the story was that God's grace wasn't limited to certain people or even certain seasons of life. It was limitless. So God's grace can be found in the storm. Sometimes the storm itself is actually God showing his grace. To go back to my own story, I had found myself years ago in a bit of a storm, living in a place that I didn't want to live. I wanted to make a change, but much like those sailors just rowing and never getting back to land, I just felt like I couldn't get anywhere. But as I prayed, the message was clear: stay there. So reluctantly, with quite a bit of complaining, that's what I did. I stayed. I didn't move. And it's fun to look back on now because of what happened soon after. Right after I decided to stay, I was suddenly able to connect with a small group of guys. We studied the Bible together. We developed community that I hadn't had yet. Around the time I was considering moving away, my wife Ginger was actually moving to Houston. If I'd gotten my way and gotten out of here, I wouldn't have met her. There were so many opportunities over those next couple of years to be teaching and leading things that I wasn't quite ready for, but I got this season of training. And looking back now, I can see that season, that struggle, challenged me and matured me. So many things I'm thankful for now are a result of that season. I thought I was stuck and I just wanted to get out. But now I can look back and see that God was using that storm I was stuck in to show me his grace. So you might be thinking you're in a storm right now. What is that struggle, that season of life you're fighting through? What might God be trying to reveal to you in that? What might he be teaching you? What might he be training you for right now? If you're in one of those seasons, I would encourage you that instead of just trying to push through or hide out until it's over, that it might be time to see what God might be revealing to you in that season. And if you're not in the storm right now, if you're not in one of those seasons, I want to challenge you to not be like Jonah. My guess is you have people around you in your neighborhood, in your schools, and they're just like those sailors. They're crying out, looking for someone to believe in, something to deliver them. And if you're a Jesus follower, you know the answer. You can step out in those storms and show God's grace to people. Show them that he's actually chasing them down with his grace. So don't hide out and check out like Jonah did. Step up, speak up, knowing that God's grace is limitless, even in the storm. As we've studied Jonah and gotten so familiar with that story, I keep asking myself, what did Jonah miss out on because he put limits on God's grace? What do we miss out on when we put limits on God's grace? And if we stopped doing that, what could he do in our lives? What could he do in the lives of those around us? Continue to think about that question. How have I put limits on God's grace?